Namah Shivaya Yoga Union. Today, we got a very, very special conversation for everybody. I'm here with Kristoffer Hughes. And Chris, if it's okay, I will read a little bit of your bio from your book.
Okay.
It says Kristoffer Hughes is chief of the Anglesey Druid Order, a Mount Haemus Scholar, and a member of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. Hughes worked professionally for His Majesty's Coroner for over 30 years. He is a Welsh language television presenter and actor, author of many books, from The Cauldron Born, The Book of Celtic Magic, As the Last Leaf Falls, and Ceridwen, as well as the creator of both the Celtic Tarot and the Yuletide Tarot. So, yeah, before we get into it, Chris, I'd like to offer, obviously, on behalf of all the yogis, our salutations and warm greetings, to yourself and the whole Druid order throughout the world.
Thank you very much.
Yes, no
Thank you.
worries.
Bendición Canes back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I guess we have to start at zero, and for me, that's the question. What exactly is it? What is a druid? What does that even mean now? The history, the vision of reality. What
That's the
is it?
million-dollar question, right?
Yes. Yes.
It's funny, isn't it, how such a small word can be so loaded with so much meaning that spans almost an impossible amount of time that is very difficult for people to conceptualize or even articulate. Half the time, I can't remember what happened last Tuesday, let alone the birth of this word. But this word has been within the European vernacular for 2000 years. And we're aware historically, archaeologically, from various sources like the classical authors of who the ancient Druids of Northern Europe were. The Roman classical authors wrote quite a bit about those. And then in the year 62 of the Common Era, there was an enormous invasion here on the island of Anglesey, where I live, where the order is based. That was to take care of those pesky druids who were holding and assimilating so much support for the resistance against Rome. And this was seemingly the home of the ancient druids. So when the Romans came, took care of the Druids, we became Celto-Romano people for the next 4 centuries. And then when the Romans left and the Brythonic language, the ancient language of Britain, developed and evolved into Old Welsh, the term druid or derwydd in the Welsh language, meaning somebody who is tree wise or perhaps oak wise, because the term drw is a reference specifically to oak trees. So it's somebody who has an intimate understanding or a relationality between themselves and the trees. So that word started to not be used as a personal rank or title for people as we moved towards a more bardic expression of Welsh culture. And the peculiar thing is that Welsh language, Welsh culture evolved and interwove with bardism. It evolved because of poetry, not in spite of it. Poetry wasn't something that happened in a vacuum. It evolved with the very structure of the language itself. And we found that the ancient bards were mythologizing this memory for them only 400-500 years in the past of who these ancient druids were, but they were expressing that through a bardic methodology, but they were mythologizing them. And you see them speak of the qualities of the fact that they were able to prophesy, that they were wise, that they had skills beyond perhaps the scope of the ancient bards. And for centuries, that remained all the way up until the 1700s, when this concept of Druidry became something so quintessentially British that the English started to cling to it to cling to it as an identity of something that was inherently wise, in a country, in a nation, on an island that has constantly been invaded by Romans and Normans and Anglo-Saxons, this constant, I guess, a dilution of who, in fact, the Britons were. But so it was the English that first took hold of this concept of, oh, the Druids, they were wise, they wore really cool stuff, and they hung out at Stonehenge. Let's have a bit of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the Welsh, they were looking at the Welsh, they were looking at the Scots. We had our bards, and the English took this idea of the Druid. But then suddenly the Welsh and the Scots were like, hold on a minute, those are ours.
Yeah.
So we started, there was a bit of a kickback. So the Welsh started to take this idea again of the bards and the druids were kind of similar, perhaps even one and the same thing, expressing the same quality of divine inspiration, the expression of poetry as something that expressed one being a co-creator with the universe, not a passive observer.
Mm.
And that degree of mysticism really took off. So the Welsh culture really embraced this idea of the Druid. And then in 1792, the Gorsedd of Bards of the island of Britain, which is identifiable by its Druids. And we see them every August in the rituals and ceremonies of the National Eisteddfod of Wales. And the peculiar thing is that within the last 300 years, whilst Druidry was something that was mythologized within our bardic traditions for over a millennia, within the last 300 years, Druidry has become something that is endemic to our culture. It is an integral, intrinsic part of our expressiveness. And then in 2023, I was initiated into that particular order as a druid within the Gorsedd of Bards of the island of Britain, which was quite remarkable. So ultimately, within that one word, dru, meaning oak, it to come from to know, is this implication that there is wisdom to be found from our kin in the natural world, and that those particular beings within the natural world, oak trees in particular, act as teachers.
Mm.
However, there's something else that is so cool within that particular Indo-European root word, dru, is the belief that it's related to the Sanskrit word drush, which means door.
Mm.
And if that's the case, then not only is the oak seen as an embodiment of wisdom, but perhaps also a doorway or a portal through into wisdom. And that got me thinking okay, so what other things do Indo-European Celtic languages share with distant cultures like, the sub-Himalayan cultures? And of course, we find that the Welsh language, the Brythonic language, shares so much root etymology with Sanskrit, which makes
Wow.
perfect sense when you consider the migration of cultures from sub and post, or what's above, epi-Himalayan
Mm.
cultures as they moved towards the European strata. They brought these words and brought these cultures with them, which I find really exciting because I think it demonstrates that not only is there wisdom to be found in the way in which we use language and words, but that there is also unity and connection in how these things have traveled over thousands of miles over so many different cultures to express a
Mm.
wisdom in the 21st century, which I love, right? And even when one looks at mythology, so mythology, storytelling, poetry is such a cornerstone within not just the Druid tradition, but within Celtic culture in general.
Mm.
I know, and now we identify Celtic culture as being seven different nations, not a homogenized whole, but rather seven different expressions within a Celtic cultural framework. And storytelling and bardism is so integral to those cultures. And I guess even when we look at the secular world, we're still obsessed with telling stories, right? We're
Mm.
still, whether we're watching movies or reading a book, there's still this process of being in some kind of co-creation with something creative. And I love that about the fact that it's expressed within Druidic spirituality. That storytelling is so important. And when we look at our myths, when we look at our legends and our folklore, they have striking similarities to other Indo-European bodies of mythology, but
Mm,
also as far as India and other regions of Mongolia and China. They share a commonality.
mm.
And I find that quite exciting as well in how wisdom can be expressed through the stories that we tell each other.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
Fascinating. That's such a fascinating link. I mean, this thing about the trees and I mean, if I think to some more in Indian cultures, Lord Buddha, he gained enlightenment sitting under the tree,
yeah.
Lord Shiva, famously with the Rudra tree, has a very special significance. I mean, the oak tree, um, can you speak on that? Like, what is this connection with the oak tree that is there in the Celtic Druidism?
I think the first thing, I think when we consider these iconographic symbols, these metaphors that we find within language and spirituality, I think the first thing that we do is that we actually go and look directly at an oak tree. You know, break it
Mm,
down to the very simple thing, right?
mm,
What's in
mm,
front of us? Why did our ancestors have a particular connection to this particular tree? So when we
mm,
look at oak, it becomes very obvious very quickly why the oak. It's an incredibly majestic tree. It's one
mm,
of our most long-lived trees that are deciduous and indigenous to the British Isles, apart, of course, from a yew, which is a very different species of tree and perhaps the only true immortal on the planet. But the oak
mm,
is majestic. It hangs its boughs down as if the boughs itself are trying to touch the earth. Every part of the oak tree seems to want to re-earth itself or reconnect itself to the earth. And it was one of the most common trees here on the British Isles. So even the Isle of Anglesey, which is not as wooded anymore post-industrialization and post-agriculture, but if you went back 2,000 years ago, this island was predominantly oak trees. And the same can be said for so many swathes of the British Isles. So this tree was always there as a companion, as a source. The acorns were nourishment. It holds so much diversity within its trunk, within its branches. And it lives for centuries of time. And usually oak trees are incredibly majestic. They have a poise to them and a demeanor that seems
mm,
to say something or lend itself to stories. And then, of course, we start seeing oak trees coming into mythology, being referred to as the world tree or the tree between worlds,
mm,
and acting as not only an initiator into mystery, but also as something that is indicative, perhaps, of this concept of the tree of life or the tree at the center of all things. Excuse me. And that when we look at other world spiritualities and what eventually became religions, what do we find at the heart of almost all of them is a tree, is
mm,
a single tree that seems to evoke this sense of otherness whilst also being incredibly connected to everything within its square mile. And of course, now we understand, we have a scientific understanding of how trees work, how their mycelia networks work within this wood wide web where they're constantly in communication with one another.
mm,
We use terms like axis mundi to to
mm,
to describe that cosmological axis. And in so many traditions, it's depicted as a tree, whether it's the Coeden y Bydoedd in the Welsh tradition, whether it's Yggdrasil in the northern traditions, whether it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life in biblical studies, or the terebinthian trees of Mame later in the book of Genesis and Exodus. And then when we look to the Far East, when we look to indigenous cultures, trees, trees, trees. It's
mm,
like, okay,
mm.
so we like trees, right? They're
Yes.
telling us something
Yeah.
about who and what we are. So in the from the druidic perspective, there's a metaphorical or a cosmological tree, which is the axis mundi, the tree between all worlds. And that at the very bark, the very trunk of that tree, all polarizing forces are unified. But of course, she has roots. And she has mycelia networks that reach out and feed the rest of the forest. So wherever we are in the forest, wherever we are in the world, we need only touch a single root and it is connected to all trees.
Yeah.
Everything leads back to the world tree, which is why you will usually find that within modern occulture, but also as well historically and mythologically, if druids have a tool, a magical tool, then perhaps I can even reach one. I can. Then our magical tools are these.
A wand.
It's just a wand, right?
Yeah.
And people will think, oh, how very,
Yeah.
Harry Potter.
Yeah.
But no, not at all, because the wand represents that bridge, that connection between the druid and our kin in the forest. So, and even when we look at the Welsh language in particular, you can see how it itself evolved from this mysticism, but also the metaphor of trees. So our word for science, the ordinary everyday word for science, gwyddoniaeth, means the language of trees. Our alphabet is wyddor, which again is like the expression of trees. Gwyddoch, to know, the trees told me. Gwyddionadur, encyclopedia, the trees told me I shan't be questioned. It's like it's everywhere in
I
our
love that.
language. And
Yeah.
of course, der gwydd. So derwydd is made up of two composites, der for oak and gwydd meaning tree, to know, to be aware of on a very subtle level. This term gwydd also refers to trees. So it's everywhere within
Mm.
our culture, this understanding that the trees are able to transmit some form of wisdom to us. And I think we as modern people in the 21st century can take so much wisdom from that.
Mm.
The oak tree at the bottom of my garden just wants to be that oak tree in its own expression, standing empowered in its own wisdom. The rowan at the other end of my garden just wants to express the qualities of rowan. It doesn't compete, it doesn't want to shout over the other trees. It expresses its true nature in relationality with everything around it, but it's its own being. And sometimes I think, oh my word, wouldn't that be an amazing thing if all human beings could do that? But we
Yeah.
don't. We try and pacify, we try and keep up with the Joneses, we try and be things that we truly aren't. We find ourselves acting so often, trying to
Mm.
fit in, whereas the trees are just saying, sweetie, no, be
Mm.
your own tree and use the fruits of that tree to express who you truly are. So, from metaphorical perspectives, philosophical, cosmological, mythological, folkloric, the trees are the heart, if you like, of the Druid tradition and that search for wisdom and unity that they represent, which I love. And although, to say the search for wisdom, that isn't to imply either that it's easy. We don't all
Mm.
feel wise all the time and we have knee-jerk reactions. And sometimes, I go and hide under my duvet with a kilogram bar of Galaxy milk chocolate watching reruns of RuPaul's Drag Race and don't feel particularly wise. But it's that search for it
Yeah.
which I love about the expression of my spirituality.
Beautiful. So beautiful.
Mm,
When you're talking about, the language and the history, it feels to me that there was this deep connection that we used to have with the natural
mm,
world.
yeah.
I mean, it's more difficult. A lot of us live in cities now, and maybe part of this disconnection has caused a lot of unhappiness, probably. How can we reconnect, let's say, with a tree? Because it's funny because it's almost pejorative. If you say, oh god, this person's a tree hugger,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
almost
yeah.
like it's like an insult, actually. It's, oh, they're a bit nuts.
Yes.
um but how could you suggest for people, maybe they're living in a city, how can we reconnect and develop that link so that it's almost like we're in that communion with the tree?
Yes. I think I think sometimes we can overcomplicate it as well, in that
Mm,
we can consider that we are removed from nature. But I think that's also a very subtle and also a fairly subversive message and programming that's come through modernity, that we are somehow over or superior to nature. We
mm,
try and
yeah.
get nature to submit to our will.
Yes. Yeah.
We've become extremely powerful, technologically advanced to be able to suppress natural cycles. And then when all of a sudden nature turns up as nature invariably does, and we are unable to control it, we feel smited, we feel insulted, and we
Mm,
feel weak and almost affronted that nature had the audacity, the gumption to throw a hurricane at us or to bring a storm off of the Atlantic that takes our power for 4 days. And I think it's only during those particular points when nature isn't fighting back, nature's just doing what
mm,
nature does and is in her
mm,
nature to do, that we suddenly feel that, oh, actually, we can't control it to the extent that we think we can. But we're all programmed to believe that we have some form of superiority over natural forces. And I think that can then cause us to feel extremely disconnected from the natural world, to
mm.
feel almost afraid or anxious to be lost in the wilderness or to even intentionally go and lose yourself in the highlands of Scotland or in the mountains of Eterrna for 3 days and just sit with a river. We don't do that anymore because we
Mm.
have so many other things to occupy our minds.
Yes, yes,
So
exactly.
many things. And I think
Yeah.
even when it comes to this as well, as a druid, I firmly believe, my opinion entirely, that what people really want is the sense of the village, to be in the
Mm,
village where the village holds you, the village supports you. But of course, now
mm,
we live in a global village where we can get to any point on the planet in less than 24 hours, where we can have 5,000 people who we call friends on these devices. And yet, we spend the majority of that time fighting with people we have no connection to because they've had an opinion that differs to ours, which always seems rather futile in a space that is so all encompassing, yet simultaneously displays a disconnect. So I
mm.
think that we have to be very careful in the way that, I mean, obviously we need these things, and the device that I'm speaking to you with right now, we need these things. But I think also it's about how we moderate that with the understanding that human nature is nature. It's a part of nature and can never be separated from it. And that when we do separate ourselves from it, we start to become unwell, we start to
Yes.
suffer from mental disconnect that can
Yes.
affect the chemical levels in our brains and cause us to become
Yeah.
depressed or anxious or develop other connection issues with one another. We start to suddenly be affected by seasonal affected disorders. And
Mm,
my father was, oh my word, he was the worst sad sufferer in existence.
mm,
And yet I'm like, well, why? I said, stop sitting in your house all winter. You
mm,
live in Llanberis, you live at the foot of Snowdon. I said, why don't you go out every single day, regardless of how grey the clouds are, and go and sit by the river, go and sit by the lake?
mm.
And he's like, that's not going to do anything. But he did it. And then a year later, he was like, I've not been suffering from seasonal affected
Yeah.
disorder so much. I'm like, be a part of the planet, Dad. So-
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he suddenly had a sense of that. And then we had this amazing conversation just prior to his death of how he had never at any point in his life conceptualized that he is nature. He's a
Mm,
microcosm of the macrocosm, and that macrocosm is nature, which is a microcosm of a deeper macrocosm, the cosmology of our solar system, which is a microcosm of the macrocosm of the Milky Way, and on and
mm,
on and on ad
mm.
infinitum, that we are all deeply connected. So I think sometimes when we consider we might live in a concrete jungle. I've worked and lived in London, in Los Angeles, And in all of those places, there were always instances of seeing a red campion that burst through a crack in the pavement,
Mm.
or a nettle or a burdock. And you think, and you look at it, just in a bit of paving in the middle of Ealing in West London, and you're
Mm.
like, if we fix it in inverted commas, by spraying it with weed killer, or somebody comes along with a hoe, the red campion and nettle disappear. But if we were to leave it, very, very quickly, it would start consuming and breaking up that concrete. I think it doesn't matter where we are or how much we think we can suppress the powers of the natural world, it has the ability and the tenacity to break through it at any point. And if we stem it, hold it back, it remains at bay. But once we neglect our structures,
Mm.
nature very quickly comes back and goes, girl,
Yeah.
oh, I'm always here. So, and I'm a huge advocate, and I found it quite fascinating actually in the last 10 years because of the surge of mindfulness, of being mindful, which on one hand I found quite ludicrous that we even needed to be reminded what it is to be mindful. But I think
Mm.
again that's a symptom of modernity. But that within that mindfulness, they started advocating people go and sit with trees, just go
Yeah.
and sit with your back to a tree, and then like the term that you mentioned earlier on, this concept of tree hugger, and
Yeah.
suddenly modern medicine, modern psychotherapy and psychology are going, oh, actually, we think there's probably some benefit in just doing that, of being purposefully and intentionally close to nature, which I think for me, I require that. I need that. I need the solitude and solace and silence that comes from taking myself away, even if it's just once a year for 2 weeks alone into the
Mm.
natural world, as close to the natural world as I can possibly be, but alone. And I
Mm.
find that incredibly nourishing for not only my own mental well-being, but also for my spirituality and a sense of connection to the world.
Yeah.
So I think it's significantly simpler than people might think. If you live in the middle of Cardiff, my word, you've got the most stunning. You can go and sit in the castle grounds, right, in the castle park, or take the boat from the castle down to the bay,
Mm.
or sit
Mm.
in the bay, and doesn't matter. And London, I found London to be an incredible place for having moments of connecting to the natural world in silence. And I always chose the London cemeteries for that because they
Mhm.
don't always have an awful lot of people in them, but they're these green, quiet spaces where,
Mm.
not only are you surrounded by nature, you're also surrounded by the dead. So, who knows
Yeah.
what could happen in there. And
Yeah.
so to be able to have those moments, I think, is soul nurturing.
Yes. Yes.
And then when we look at the ceremonies, the ritualistic activities of modern contemporary Druidry, those ceremonies are about developing practices in which we acknowledge those macrocosmic forces within our microcosm, and that we honor those in relationality, understanding that human beings are not in isolation to nature. We're not in isolation to the trees. Elements of who we are territorial and geographical
Mm.
and cosmological. And on my sojourns, around the world, I've listened to so many wise people who have reiterated those principles, And one of the most remarkable encounters, several encounters that I had was in India and in Indonesia. I had such remarkable encounters of familiarity and of relationality with people who I had very long considered in my 50 odd years on this earth to have been distant cultures that I had absolutely nothing in common with. Then
Mm.
suddenly you sit down with these people, and then that moment you can sense that tree pulling you together, that sense of
Mm.
unification, that all cultures share this commonality of
Yeah.
territorial, geographical, and cosmological principles that bleed into everything.
Yeah.
And we can learn so much from each other of how we move back into a conscious relationship with the natural world as aspects of it, not as in isolation.
Yeah, very beautiful and such an important message, I think. Um, One thing that I read, well, from once I came into contact with you, was this concept in Druidry of Awen.
Mm,
It struck me very similar to like in yoga we have the word prana,
yeah, yeah.
like a universal life force. I was wondering if you could
Mm.
speak on this Awen.
Yes, it's exactly that. And it's remarkable actually how after my trip to India, and I was in Varanasi for a significant amount of time, and I spoke to this amazing. Every time I think about it, my heart fills with warmth. It was in one of the death hotels in
Hmm.
Varanasi, where
Hmm.
people go at the end of their lives, returning to zero, preparing for the end. And we were not filming with this particular gentleman, and then he called me over at the end, and he said, "Can I ask you something?" And he had the most impeccable English, and he said, "Are you a druid?" And I thought, what the hell? Said, um, yes. I said, but how do you know that in the
Yeah,
middle of Varanasi, right?
yeah.
And he said, oh, I recognize what you have on your arm.
Ah, okay.
I'm like, girl, what?
Wow.
What's going on here? And then it turns out, right, that he had a connection to a bunch of people who live up near in the Assam region of like northern
Okay.
India,
Yeah.
who are Hindu druids. I know,
Wow.
right? I was like,
Wow. Mind
what?
blowing.
What? I need to know about this, you know? And it turns out these Hindu druids have a genetic diversity, right? So
Yeah.
they may have a parent from an Indian cultural background or genetic background, and the other parents may be of European
Yeah.
culture and background. So they've found a way to combine the what appears perhaps on the surface to be different philosophies that actually bear a striking similarity one to the other. So this lovely, lovely, lovely man in the Death Hotel in Varanasi suggested, he said, go down to this bookshop, he said, and get yourself a copy of the Holy Vedas. So I went down and bought it. And and then very quickly I'm like, this is a book of poetry.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like,
Yes.
what on earth? How did I not know that? This
Yeah.
is a book of poetry. And then within those poetry, there's these descriptions of forces, of powers that I'm reading it thinking, that's what I call Awen.
Yeah.
It is describing a force that is strikingly familiar because of Awen. And so we depict the Awen. You can see it behind me. See it there?
Yeah.
These three rays that in some traditions have three dots on top of it. And but essentially, let me try and think now because I've written whole books about this. Put it in a nutshell, right? So it's to be put on the spot. So imagine that there is no thing. So not a nothing, but a no thing beyond any form of articulation at the very
Yes.
beginning of our universe's time. And that in that no thing, a potential stirred. And in its stirring, the no thing became a thing. And as soon as it became those two things, it immediately became three things. The no thing that became a thing, and then the relationship between them. And in that fraction, or even to say a fraction of a second is to limit it, in that split fraction of a tenth of a billionth of a second, the universe became aware of itself and it exploded in glee and joy of like, I'm alive
Yeah.
all of a sudden. And in that explosion, three blinding rays of light shot out from the no thing. And as those rays of light shot forward, the whole potential for existence burst into being. Atoms and molecules that would eventually lead to nebulae and galaxies and stars and planets and packets of crisps and chocolate bars all came as an expression of these three blinding rays of light. But what I love is, which I also found similar when looking at the Holy Vedas, was it carries a song. It's
Mm,
not just light, but it's
yeah.
sound, and it's sound alliteration, and that the universe sings three sounds, three vowels, and those vowels bring about all things in existence by this song. And then fast forward from those philosophies to the 20th century, and then scientists discover that the universe does sing. It
Mm.
sings. It sings in, well, it sings in a key that's 27,000 octaves below middle C, but it's singing. And then that song is reflected in, oh my gosh, I don't know if you've ever looked it up, right? But oh my word, Shiv, if you do Google, or anybody who's listening, Google the hum of the earth.
Okay.
Because scientists have discovered that our planet sings. She has a hum, and the hum changes depending whether it's mountainous, flat, stormy, rainy, how
Yeah.
tumultuous the ocean is, the earth sings. And it feels from a druidic perspective that the earth is singing the lyrics to the music of the cosmos. So when
Wow.
the universe went, wah, I'm alive, it didn't have lyrics, it just had sound. And the way that I perceive it in my Druidry is that every other thing, from this computer to my flask of coffee to you to a distant Mrs. Evans who lives in deepest, furthest regions of Nebraska, all of us are the lyrics to that song. And that's what makes us so uniquely, beautifully magical. It's like, stop trying to be other people, because the universe wants you to find your lyrics and sing in co-creation with it. Not
Mm.
to just hum along, but co-create. And the philosophy of Awen is that, with that in mind, we are a verb. We are an actual verb. We are something that the universe is doing in its
Mm.
entirety. And just for this picosecond on the geological clock, we come into existence and we add lyrics to that experience.
Mm.
And then a picosecond later, this body falls away, but the universe carries those lyrics. It still has those lyrics. And in 10, 15 billion years' time, the universe will go, oh my word, do you remember those lyrics? Who sang those lyrics? And they'll go, oh, that was Shiv, that was from Cardiff. And the universe will go, oh yeah, where is Shiv? And there you are in the memory of the universe, woo, singing,
Yeah.
in your new lyrics. And for some reason within that metaphor, that philosophy, that cosmology, I find immense joy and also comfort in, we are a part of the song. In our loneliest points in life, find your lyrics and hum, and you will hum in tune. Even if you don't think you know the tune, you will hum with the universe, and understand and realize that what you are is a manifestation of that co-creation. We are not in isolation. And the Awen tells us that. It tells us you are not in isolation. You exist as a fundamental part of the universe experiencing itself. And when that awen blows through you, because the word awen means blessed or holy breath, right? So it's
Mm.
carrying this concept of breathing, of singing, of orating, of speaking, of dancing, of
Mm.
expressing your creativity through sound. And when we look at the etymological roots of all other words associated with spirituality, they come from the same principle. Spirit, from the Latin word espiritus, meaning vital breath, or the vitality of breath. And that the word spirit and the word soul are not connected. They're related, but they're not the same thing. Spirit means of breath, soul means, from the Anglo-Germanic term saula, meaning of the sea. And I love that, because there's only one
Mm.
sea. we just compartmentalize it. But there's only one ocean. We just call it Mediterranean, Pacific, Atlantic, but it's the same body of water, you know.
Yeah.
And that from that soul, the universe, are all of these breaths, these spirits who are singing, whether it's a mountain or a stream or a human being or a cat. We are all co-creating, and the Awen blows through us. And when we step consciously into it and blow it forward, it becomes what I call a DTI, or a druid transmitted infection. You know, and that infection is inspiration. And once you catch inspiration, you know those moments, right? You know those moments where you hear something, or you listen to someone, or you hear a piece of music or a piece of writing, and you're like, and that
Yeah.
flash of inspiration hits you, and you feel compelled to like, I've got to do something
Yeah.
about this. That's Awen. That's the sense of it. And of course, in Ireland, they call it Immas. In Indian culture, they call it Prana, or they might call it Chi in different cultures. That all these cultures, all these different peoples on our planet have had a name that equates to that force, that
Yes.
power that courses through us. And isn't that funny? It's like, yeah, but prior to aeroplanes and ships, we were all thousands, if not tens of thousands of miles apart. And yet we all share this commonality of expression, of a cosmology, right at the very foundations of who we are, is this unity. And to me, I consider that to be all of the expressions, whatever name we use, the names are the way in which we find the root of the tree that leads us to the tree of life, where every force is unified. And we capture that just in that symbol
Yeah.
and the word Awen.
Beautiful. Wow. That was
Crazy, right?
incredible. That was incredible. Um, I want to talk about a topic. So, you know, I think sometimes in the West, our relationship to death
Hmm.
is a little bit I don't know, maybe we have some things to learn about it.
Yeah.
I want to say because in Wales anyway, I know you can go onto S4C and see your documentaries that you did. You went to different countries, and you mentioned it earlier actually in the interview. Um, Seeing how other cultures approach the dying and
Mm.
process, right? Can you speak on this? Like, were there any highlights, anything that surprised you? Because you yourself, you worked as a coroner for years, didn't you, in this country?
Yes,
It
yes.
would
So
be
I,
fascinating
yeah,
to have your insight on this.
yeah. So 32 years I worked for His Majesty's Coroner Service, or Her Majesty's Coroner Service back
Yeah,
then,
yeah,
before her death. And so my background is in anatomical pathology. So I was an autopsy technologist for 32 years, but also
okay,
a mortuary and bereavement officer as well. So dealing with the bereaved and dealing with other agencies that have businesses within public mortuaries, which in other parts of the world, like Canada and the United States, the word that they would be familiar with would be a morgue.
Hmm.
Over on the other side of the Atlantic, mortuary can also mean funeral home, but it means something very
Right,
different here. A
yeah,
public facility for the investigation and storage of the dead. So that's always been my life. This intersectionality of my druidry and my work as a death service professional. They both informed one another. They swam in and
yeah,
out like
mm,
intricate Celtic knotwork somehow. And so when I retired from the coroner service in 2021, I'd always dabbled in television, in Welsh television, and I had this opportunity to create a documentary which can be seen internationally on S4C Click. That's Click without a K on the end, CLIC, which is their on-demand service, and they have an international section there. And it's available on the BBC iPlayer as well, all with subtitles. And so because we have this distance from death in the West. There's an amazing anthropologist and philosopher called Ernest Becker who wrote a book in the I believe, the beginning of the 1980s called The Western Denial of Death, which is
Mm,
extremely illuminating of how we've distanced ourselves from this visceral component of death and dying, predominantly from the time of Queen Victoria. So it's not even that long ago. It's just the latter half of the 1800s. And Queen Victoria was almost single-handedly responsible for the way in which we deal with death in the modern world. She was known as the mourning queen. She mourned for 40 years. She developed fashions and trends and aesthetics that were mournful and deathly and gave rise to the industrialization of the funeral industry. And
mm,
we have now just become, I guess, just hapless, innocent bystanders and participants in a system that was developed in spite of us. It developed
mm,
by industrialization, and our connection to death started to fall away and became more aesthetically pleasing. So we have beautiful crematoria, we have cemeteries that are all pristine and lovely with headstones and flowers, but it's a veneer. It's hiding the cold reality of what death actually looks like. You know, what happens behind the crematorium curtains, what happens to a body when it's in the ground is not something we want to engage with. So we only engage with the aesthetics that are psychologically pleasing to us. But those aesthetics essentially are myths that we tell ourselves, and then we believe them. So then we believe that only one way of doing it is right, and only this way is respectful. And it informs our entire understanding of mortuary rituals and practice. So then we go around the world, had just had our minds blown from the perspective of different cultures not having that veneer. The veneer just didn't exist because, on one hand, not that it's entirely her fault, but on one hand, we had Queen Victoria and they didn't, to
yeah,
inform and
yeah.
program them. So when we were in Mexico and participating in the Dias de los Muertos celebrations from both a secular perspective, but also from Aztec Mayan traditions that continue to be honored in certain regions of Mexico, where the distance between the living and the dead was not observable. You couldn't see it. And for Dias de los Muertos, the bones of the ancestors come out of their graves. They spend time cleaning them, creating beautiful new wraps for the bones, telling stories to the children who were very young. The youngest was 3 years old. And to see a 3-year-old little boy with the femur of his great grandmother happily, very
Wow.
happily
Yeah.
cleaning it,
Mm,
taking the dust off of it, listening to his grandmother telling him stories of, and the stories were relational. So he had a femur, which for a 3-year-old is pretty big, you know.
mm,
But she was telling this little boy how his great grandmother walked through life. She was making the stories relational to every single part of her physical remains. And it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen because I, as a stranger who had no connection to this family, I had a vision of who this woman was. She came alive in that moment. And I could see the joy, the sense of connection that those children had to an ancestor who had died 35 years ago,
mm,
who they never met. But in that moment, she was alive and it was indisputable. She was present, and that presence didn't need to be a ghost. It didn't need to be an apparition, all the things that television feeds us of what a dead person looks like if it comes back. It was none of that. It was presence, the sense of someone being there by the collective narrative of the people who were pulling her from the very fabric of the universe's memory itself. And there she was. And it was deeply touching. And then to look around at my camera crew, my director, my producer, all crying. Grown men who I have never seen cry before were
Mm.
weeping in this moment. And I'm like, whoa. And afterwards, when we were talking about it, they all said exactly the same thing. They were like, she was there. We could
Mm.
feel her presence. And then we went to India, and oh my word, this sense of ritual, the richness of ritual, of preparation, how the deceased person is prepared by the family, is dressed and clothed, anointed, washed, decorated with flowers and garlands. This intimate connection that the family had with the actual deceased person. And yes, we could see that there was and I genuinely, I don't want to sound ignorant, but I genuinely can't remember what the name of there was a person who was like emceeing the proceedings,
Mm.
but they weren't a
Mm.
funeral director, you know?
Mhm.
They were like more in a priestly capacity rather than a professional capacity. And then watching the women preparing this we witnessed so many cremations, but we followed some of them, and the families were just so hospitable and so willing to share the whys and the whats of the process. They were so incredibly warm in their hospitality to us as strangers. And watching the women do their rituals of preparation and then handing the deceased person over to, they were young men and boys, some of them, who would carry the person singing their hearts out, rocking the person up and down as they ran through the alleyways of Varanasi. I mean, like down
Yeah.
street, I was like, oh my gosh, how on earth are they doing this? Singing and chanting, and the whole atmosphere was one of a joyous understanding of something deeper than just the death of an individual. There was a sense that significantly more was happening within that moment than we could understand as Western people, because it was such an intricate part of the fabric of their culture. And then it's these boys taking their deceased, I think it was their grandmother, I think, down to the Varanasi Ghats, to the cremation Ghats. And it was them who placed the body. And then it was the oldest son, I think. And watching this ceremony and ritual of where they shaved him from head to toe and dressed him in this beautiful white robe and anointed him and then gave him the torch to light the pyre underneath his grandmother's body. And then standing there, and there is no easy way to say it, smelling that, smelling the ghee, the sandalwood, and then smelling a human body actually burning in front of you. The the visceral input of the smoke rising, of the heat rising, with like 48 other people being cremated at the same time. Nothing was hidden, nothing was shameful, embarrassing, distasteful, unsympathetic. All these words that we use in the vocabulary of how we do death in the West. None of those words were valid because they were not, it was just simply not valid. This was culture expressing its desires, its philosophy, and its honor to a person who, at that moment, there on the edges of Mother Ganga in Varanasi, that individual fell off the cycle of life, death, and rebirth.
Mm.
And as she, there's a point, I won't go into all of those details because they could possibly be a little bit triggering and grim, but there was a point where something happened and it was indicative of her being absorbed into Lord Shiva. And
Mm.
she became one with the Godhead, one with deity, one with divinity. And of course, we don't have a cultural understanding or a cosmological understanding of what that means, but we could feel it there. I could feel its tangibility of, I felt this sudden sense of, oh my word, it's over. And I'm like, where does that come from? Where am I getting that from? And then we were talking to the boys of the family who were down at the cremation cats, and then they started telling me. I didn't tell them what I was sensing. But then, of their own volition, they described how she was knackered. She was exhausted. She's like, I've done this life, this living so many times.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm done, and I know that I'm done. I've reached the end, so and so they came to Varanasi. They weren't from Varanasi, but of course, if you die in Varanasi and if you get cremated in Varanasi, there's like this may sound flippant, and I don't mean it to sound flippant, but it's almost like a fast track
Yeah. Yeah.
off the
Yes.
wheel.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and that was her sense. She was like, I've done everything. I've done all. Now it's time for me to
Yeah. Be
move on.
absorbed. Yeah.
And
Yes.
it was tangible. And then you've got the temple to Lord Shiva, which is stunning because oh my word, it's stunning. Built during the pandemic. The temple itself is thousands of years old and it's quite small, but they built this complex around it to accommodate the millions of people who go there. Beautiful, beautiful place. And you can hear the chanting coming from
Yeah.
the temple and this sense of visceral connection to the dead, but also to the cosmology surrounding the dead.
Mm.
And we don't have that. And then Indonesia, whilst different practices, they don't practice cremation, they practice burial and entombment in rocks, where they dig out graves in rocks. But it was similar in there being no distance between the living and the dead. The dead are part of the very fabric of who we are. We are their sum totality. But here we like things to be very clean on the surface of things and very proper. And to see the reactions as well. We always obviously get a lot of feedback from television programs and documentaries, and we come across very derogatory feedbacks, of
Yeah.
people using very derogatory terminologies to describe what was happening in Mexico, what was happening in India, what was happening in Indonesia, having absolutely no concern or no mind for, hold on, for one thing, this is not your culture. And
Mm.
what is perceived proper in your culture may not even be seen as valid in another culture, and vice versa. These are cultural expressions of beauty and spirituality. And it's amazing how when it comes to death and dying, people, probably not just in Western cultures, but probably all over the world to an extent. We can be very, very ignorant when we feel triggered and challenged by death because we don't want to talk about it. So, because we
Yeah.
never talk about it and never have those conversations, we're triggered when those things happen. And then we'll
Yeah.
have a knee-jerk reaction of, no, that's not right. Why is it not right? I don't know. It's just not right. Yeah, but can you explain why you feel like that? No, I can't. I don't want to talk about it. And
Yeah.
you get those reactions, which is quite peculiar. But to see, it sounds sensationalistic. I was doing a television show, and a part of that is that's my job. You go and do a gig. You're doing a gig. You don't expect it to impact on your life to the extent that it did.
Mm.
And it was in all locations had something unique and powerful to teach me. And the crew, I mean, the crew are looking down camera lenses, but they were profoundly affected by, and we had so much time as well. Unlike so many television programs, we didn't just drop in and immediately drop out. We were in these locations for weeks and weeks at a time. and we had a sense of immersion and of
Mm,
time, which was really important. And if anybody can get an opportunity to ever see how other cultures deal with death, take that opportunity. Because I think
mm,
when you look at how a culture or a society deals and treats with their dead, it tells you so much about who they are as a people. It's expressing something
mm.
fundamental about who they are. And I don't think people often consider that that is the case, but it very much expresses who we are. It's the most amazing thing to observe.
What do you think, in the West when we kind of sweep the topic under the rug, don't we? I mean, what's the consequence of that in for us as individuals in that society, do you think? How does it affect us spiritually?
So what I find in my experience as a death service professional, but also having gone on this, anthropological journey around the world and writing about death and dying in cultures that are either non-animistic, non-religiously cultured, non-polytheistic,
Mm,
who don't have an integral form of spiritual practice as a fundamental part of their culture. And so, here in Britain in particular, we are significantly more secular than we are Christians or otherwise. Most of us are secular. And Christianity doesn't have the same hold on society as it used to in decades
yeah.
past. So many of us are growing up without any form of spiritual succor or nourishment, which I think is part of the reason why so many people, particularly in Western cultures, have existential crises when it comes to even considering death and dying. So I find that spirituality in particular is vitally important to the human being to offset and act as a buffer against the what we refer to in anthropological circles of death and dying as the mortality salience paradigm. And the
Mm,
mortality salience paradigm is essentially you're born, you don't come with a textbook. Nobody tells you what you should do, and there's no guidebook to look at when it goes wrong. So
mm,
we have metaphorical systems, belief structures, worldviews that have seemingly naturally developed with the evolution of human beings. And whilst, yes, of course, some of those can be used coercively, some of those can be used as political ideologies, but at their foundation, I think they're answering this mortality salience paradigm that we come with. And that if unchecked or unbuffered, the mortality salience paradigm becomes an existential crisis. So, which can lead to other things as well, like increased anxiety, increased thanatophobia, the intense fear of death. And usually what we find is when we consider MSP or mortality salience paradigm, is that the majority of people have in Western cultures have this distance from death. And the distance from death comes because the concept of your apparent identity and your permanent identity have been polarized. And that secularization polarizes that concept so that the only thing that actually matters is your apparent identity. And when only your apparent identity matters, we become hyper individuated and then
mm,
more segregated. We become separate from everything
mm.
else around us because
Yeah.
all that matters is you've got to get that bigger car. You've got to get that house. You've got to work, 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 better yourself.
Mm,
Tell everybody you're successful. Make everybody else envy you because
mm,
look at you. You're so fucking successful.
mm.
And then what happens? You just die.
Yeah.
And it's like, and you've
Yeah.
tried to stave it off.
Yeah.
And then when you're dead, they'll embalm you to within an inch of next Tuesday to make you look not dead, place you in a $60,000 casket in a $5 million mausoleum, because God's forbid that you should be dead and
Mm,
look dead. And we do that, on a microcosmic level as well. We do these things that tell us, no, it's fine. They don't look dead. They're just sleeping. They're just underground in a bed. They're fine. They're fine. They're fine. And so there's this distance, and this distance is exacerbated by this existential crisis that people have in their lives. And if we think about it too much, it would be catastrophic. So we distract ourselves. We distract ourselves with work. We distract ourselves with entertainment, food, celebration. And we distract ourselves constantly to act almost as buffers against the mortality salience paradigm. Otherwise, if we didn't, then the majority of us would be hiding underneath this table, sucking on tranquilizers the size of our heads just to get through the day without screaming too much.
Yeah.
And then so spirituality and spiritual practices is what is referred to, anthropologically speaking, as a mortality buffer. It buffers us off from, because it provides meaning, significance, and transcendence. And when
Yes.
we have meaning in our lives, we feel significant. When we feel significant, we can transcend elements of ourselves that are prone to existential crisis or MSP.
Mm.
So when we lack meaning, we lack significance and cannot transcend our problems, our relationships, our sense of who we are in relation to the wider cosmos. Those three things, meaning, significance, transcendence, are vital to the holistic human being. So, and we see that as well when we consider, if you consider current events here, April of 2026, with this impending not only a war in Persia affecting the Middle East, affecting Europe, affecting the world, but this looming threat of it expanding and exacerbating to World War III. So we're all living with that fear,
Yeah.
and that fear depletes our meaning because we can't do
Mm.
anything. We can't
Yeah.
do anything. There's
Yeah.
crazy people with buttons on bombs the
Mm.
size of a small town that can vaporize the whole world. So we start losing meaning. And when that meaning starts to deteriorate, we do not feel significant. We feel insignificant as the peaceful majority. So then the whole situation can't be transcended because all of those pillars are falling down,
Mm.
which is, the attributes we give to the Awen is to love truth, to know truth, to maintain truth, or love, knowledge, and righteousness. So if in all of our actions, if love isn't present, those pillars will collapse. If
Mm.
knowledge isn't present, the pillars will collapse. If a sense of righteousness is not present, they will collapse.
Ah.
If more than one of those pillars are absent, as Whoopi Goldberg said in the movie Ghost, you're in danger, girl. You know, because
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
pillars are the foundations of meaning, significance, and transcendence, of a sense of being co-creators. And once
Mm.
they're missing, and so we look, don't we, not just at, we can look at that microcosmically, as in, why have I just had a falling out with that person over there? Which one of those pillars is missing? Is it because
Mm.
I no longer respect and love that person because I just think they're an arsehole? Why is that? Where does that knowledge come from? And how does that knowledge in any way, shape, or form mold and justify how I feel righteous about it?
Mm.
And then causes me to evaluate, well, actually, she was just holding a mirror up and I just saw myself in it and I should really cut her some
Mm.
slack. But then we can take that up to our politicians, to our world leaders, and all the way up to the top of the people who can cause significant damage in the world. But all of us live with this sense of fear that comes from an attack on who and what we are, including to so many people who are secular to the very life force itself, leading, of course, to death.
Mm.
And the fear of death, I think, is, just in some of the things I've touched on, is so complex because it's wrapped up in so much of our programming and societal expectations and a sense of this is what we do and this is what we don't do. And if there's anything in the middle, don't look at it. You know,
Yes.
you'll be
Yes.
fine, you'll be fine. But of course, spirituality, to see other cultures immersed in a profound spiritual practice that is sensory, sensual, and deeply visceral, they don't have the same existential fears because there's an
Mm.
understanding somehow that well, there's no point. There's no point to veer it because that's just an illusion. Because
Mm.
underneath it is this spiritual component.
Yes.
And so many of us in particularly in Western nations, we're losing a sense of what that is, which I think is why we see more and more people moving towards impromptu ceremonial and ritualistic activities when it comes
Yes.
to the death of loved ones who are not religious, not spiritual. COVID highlighted that so much when the ritualistic component in our society had been completely and utterly decimated by the
Mm.
pandemic. And we see it in the phenomenon here in the British Isles. Only since the early 90s, we start to see roadside shrines where there have been accidents and fatalities on motorways and roads. That never used to happen. People are ritualizing location to provide meaning to the significance of their grief in the hope that they can somehow transcend the pain of it,
Yeah.
move on, or emotionally relocate that pain. And yeah, as you can see, it's something I
Yeah.
could just go on and on about.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. Chris, I really want to ask you about this mission that you're on, called Terramation. Okay.
All right.
If you could tell us about this, it's a fascinating project that you're involved in.
It is, it is. And that came about because of the TV documentary as well, when we went to Seattle in Washington State and visited a human composting facility. Yes, I said those were human
Yeah.
composting,
Yeah,
where the
probably
human,
people are spitting out their tea somewhere,
I know, right? That's the
If
usual reaction. I go, what? What did you just
Yeah.
say?
Yeah.
And it is human composting. So in the United States of America, the scientific term for it is natural organic reduction. Here in the UK, we call it human organic transformation. And the funereal term for it is terramation, meaning to become earth. In the Welsh language, we've had to invent a word, which is amddearu, which means, again, to become earth. So it's using an ancient technology, because the technology isn't new at all. It's using
Mm,
an ancient technology in a modern concept. And essentially, what happens is that upon your death, you are taken to a terramation or human composting facility, and you're placed in a large vessel, which is around 8 foot long by 4 foot wide, 4 foot deep, big rectangular box, or it might be shaped like an oval, almost shaped almost maybe like a torpedo.
mm,
And this vessel, which I like, I even like the word vessel because it implies a journey, right? It's not
mm.
like a
Yeah,
coffin.
yeah,
There's
yeah,
no journey in a coffin, only the hearse ride to the crematorium or the cemetery, you
yeah.
know. But a coffin is designed to be hidden, go out of the way, get rid of the problem of the dead, you know. And but this vessel is half filled with gorgeous organic materials, sawdust, wood chips, straw, alfalfa, lucerne, nitrogen-rich plants, your last favorite meal, or your favorite meal, or your favorite cake, or sandwich, or a letter from your loved one, flowers from the garden, anything that can break down goes into this vessel. They fill it halfway up, and then you are then placed on top of this gorgeous material. And I got to go inside one of these boxes where you're surrounded by this smell of summer. It's
Mm,
beautiful, the really rich, sweet, gorgeous smell. So then the body is completely covered in the rest of the material, up to about 300 to 400 pounds of this organic material. And with a little gap, about 8 inches or so, between the top of the material and the top of the vessel's lid. And then it's closed. It's closed, it's sealed down, and there is a hole for air in and a hole for air out. And Within 48 hours, the microbial activity within your body is breaking out of your body by process of natural aerobic decomposition, but it's mixing with the nitrogen-rich materials within the vessel. And that mixing becomes hyper dynamic, extremely dynamic. Within 72 hours, your body no longer resembles a body anymore. It's broken down so much in 72 hours. And the heat is palpable through the vessel. The
Mm.
heat goes up to between 130 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh, wow.
And you can feel an energy dynamic, thermodynamics. You can feel it through this vessel. So what's happening inside the vessel, which is controlled, so it's not out and open to the elements, is it's expediting and speeding up the composting process. And then the temperature goes up. When the temperature comes down, they will then rotate that vessel, which is basically turning your compost like we would do in a garden. And the temperature will spike and it will go down. They'll turn it and it will do the same. And they'll go through this process for 30 days. And after 30 days, your body has completely disappeared. It's just not there anymore. The
Mm.
only thing left behind are a plate, a hip, a screw, a fake silicone boob, and
Mm.
your skeleton, your
Mm.
bones. But
Mhm.
all the bones are disarticulated. They've all come apart. They're all individual. They're breaking down. They look old, as if they've come out of an archaeological dig. So after 30 days, it's screened where the bones are removed. Inorganic materials are removed and recycled. And then the bones, in exactly the same way that happens in a crematorium. So when a flame cremation ends, there's a screening process. The contents of the incinerator is raked out, which is bones and the skeleton, placed into a metal container, and it goes into something that looks almost similar to a tumble dryer, and it's called a cremulator. And it either has teeth in it or flint balls, and it smashes the bones into a gravel. And they do that in a crematorium, and they do that in terramation. The bones go into a cremulator, smash them down. It's re-added back to the compost, and it is just soil at this point, slightly damp, but it's soil. And for the next 30 days, the bone gravel is easily digestible by the microbes in the soil.
Mm.
So for 30 days, it sits in a cube for curing and resting and drying. So it dries out. There's a bigger air hole in, bigger air hole out. And at the end of that 30 days, 60 days in total, you're just earth. You're just, well, you're not just isn't the right word. You are pure life-giving soil to give back to the very thing that fed us and watered us and nurtured us, that at the end of our lives, we can turn around to the planet and say, thank you for all of that. I'm not going to use your gas. I'm not going to poison you with chemicals or go in a sterile grave. I'm going to become life. Get
Beautiful.
yourself some trees.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Help yourself out. Get some parsnips.
And we're in the process of getting this to be possible in the UK, right?
Yeah, so the process of legalization is underway here in the UK. The UK Law Commission have completed their consultation. That's gone to central government. So we're awaiting for central government to provide some form of regulation for it to go ahead legally and regulated. So myself and my business partner, Kristoffer Hughes, we set up a campaigning company here called Eterrna, spelled with two R's. And our website gives more details as to what the process is, what it does, what its benefits are, ecologically speaking, and from an emotional perspective, from
Yeah.
a grieving perspective. And then people can join up, sign up for the newsletter to see where the story is going, what's happening with it, and to lend their support basically for something that is essentially you become life after life,
Yeah.
which isn't something we're used to using in death vocabulary. Death is final. But this
Yeah.
gives another option and another
Yeah.
choice, which
It's
at the
beautiful.
moment we don't have.
That's beautiful. Yeah, we'll put all those links in the description.
Oh, thank you.
Chris, if if people want to follow you, follow your work, how can they do that?
So they can follow me. I'm on Facebook and Instagram as Kristoffer Hughes. So my name is spelt fairly unusually, so I'm quite easy to find on social media. They can follow the Anglesey Druid Order .co.uk. They also have a Facebook page. We do online courses in Druidry. We do residential courses in Druidry. We have community rituals, workshops, events. We do all sorts, either from here in the Order's office, from our school on the other side of the island, we have in a residential school, or online. And then the other one is Eterrna.life, which is the Terramation. That's way too many things.
The
I need a holiday.
Yeah, yeah. You're very busy, Chris.
I
I
need to
tell
go
you.
and sit under a tree, Shiv.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, Chris, man, I want to say thank. This has been so fantastic, and you shared so much wisdom. I feel like a lot of beings will benefit from your words.
Oh, thank you.
And the
Thank you
way
very
you
much.
the way you deliver as well is what's the word? Inimitable. Um, so yeah, I want to thank you so much,
You're
and
more than welcome.
thank you. Yeah, and yeah, I hope to speak to you again and have you on the channel again at some point.
Brilliant.
But
Thank you, Shiv.
thank you, Chris. Okay, take care.